Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to another live stream. It is your host, Danny Dhaiphong. We have a great show for you today. Do hit that like button as you come on. That helps boost this stream in YouTube's algorithm. And we're just going to get started. So Trump's foreign policy, of course, is pushing the world closer to disaster. After Ukraine's attack on Russia's strategic bombers risked nuclear conflict, Trump was forced to call Putin and got a clear warning that Russia will retaliate. Then, after blasting Xi Jinping on Truth Social for supposedly breaking the trade truce, Trump had to call Xi Jinping and show America's weak hand in the trade war. Now, we are going to break all of this down, what it means for the multipolar world, what it means for geopolitics and the development of this burgeoning conflict amongst these new and rising powers to the east and the unipolar order in the west. We have, of course, Ben Norton of Geopolitical Economy Report. Good to see you again, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Danny.
Of course. And then we have Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. Brian, good to see you again.
Thank you for having me, and it's great to share the screen with Ben.
Yes, this is the first time.
And the same for me with Brian. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, this is great to have you two together. No one told me that we were wearing black today, but it's all right. You all are out east. It's in the morning. I'll give you all a break for you guys. All right, everyone, hit that like button, and we're gonna get right started. I wanted to start with, of course, this phone call. You know, even as we speak, there is word that Kiev is getting pounded by Russian potentially ballistic missile strikes. But the big news is that Donald Trump, after Ukraine did this absolutely reckless attack on Russia's strategic bombers, and now Russia is actually saying that these bombers weren't damaged to the degree where they were destroyed, that they will be fixed up. But nonetheless, Donald Trump spoke to Putin, was compelled to call him, and it lasted an hour and 15 minutes. He said it was a good conversation, and it will not lead immediately to peace. He did say very strongly he will have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. They discussed Iran and other matters. But Brian, I wanted to begin with you. What is the significance of all of this? How have you been reading what's been going on with these attacks, the risk? You know, some people are calling this a Cuban Missile Crisis moment, a Reshnik moment. Talk about what you are seeing with this development, especially in light of this phone call.
Well, as many people have pointed out, and as Ukraine itself admits, this operation took 18 months to organize and execute. And I think they had large ambitions. They claimed at first that they destroyed 40 plus strategic bombers. I think they tried to target at least that many. But according to U.S. officials, the New York Times, what they were able to confirm, it looks more like a single-digit number of losses for Russian damaged or destroyed Russian strategic bombers. And it's something that Ukraine cannot replicate, which is why the Ukrainian government exposed how they did it. They know this isn't something they're going to be able to do in this way again. And this is a pattern of these type of large scale public relations stunts. They do real damage, but it's not damage that's going to change the strategic trajectory of the conflict. Russia is winning a war of attrition against Ukraine and its NATO sponsors, and primary among them, the United States. Even now, even under the Trump administration, despite claims otherwise. And they're winning because of a manpower advantage that continues to grow versus Ukrainian manpower shortage and a lack of trained manpower on the Ukrainian side. Russia is winning because of accelerated munition production, weapons and munitions, missiles, artillery shells, rockets, drones. We always hear about Ukrainian drones. Russia is also making an equal or greater number of drones with, in many cases, greater capabilities than Ukrainian drones. And they're not building drones to compensate for a lack of artillery because they have that in abundance as well. So that's why Russia is advancing on the battlefield, and not because they're trying to capture territory. They are trying to grind down Ukrainian forces. As those forces crumble, Russian forces are advancing. There's no attempt to actually break through these lines. They're just wearing them down and pushing them back. And you cannot change that by destroying some strategic bombers or blowing up the Crimean bridge, which they also tried to do again recently. And as I have explained many times over the last 3 years, you cannot isolate Crimea by destroying the Crimean bridge. Crimea returned to Russia in 2014. The bridge was completed in 2018, and the land bridge was established in 2022. So for years, Russia maintained its position in Crimea without a land bridge or an actual physical bridge. And now they have a land bridge and a physical bridge. So you're not going to isolate them. You're not going to achieve anything except headlines and boosting them around. Why are they trying to do that? Because things are in irreversible decline for the U.S. proxy war. They're desperate to freeze the conflict. This has been something people have warned about since the conflict began. If it went badly, they would try to freeze it, just like they did in Syria. And so that's where we are right now. They're putting this pressure on Russia, carrying out these very symbolic attacks to maybe try to strengthen their hands and compel Russia to capitulate to some sort of ceasefire, some sort of freeze. But I don't think Russia is going to fall for it. I think they will continue doing what we see them doing. I'm not even sure if this is a retaliation right now. I think this is just a continuation of what Russia has been doing all along.
Yeah, Ben, when Trump came in, there was a lot of perhaps false enthusiasm or misguided enthusiasm about the end of this conflict being near. But with this attack that Ukraine conducted and these attacks that Brian just laid out, as well as the very clear message that Putin sent Trump, what's your reaction to where this is all heading?
Yeah, well, every time there is an attempt at having some kind of peace talks, Ukraine carries out one of these attacks. Of course, when Ukraine carried out this attack, it was actually the same day there were supposed to be peace talks that were held. And I think the full time of the meeting was like 40 minutes. It was obviously a complete failure. The only thing that they agreed on was a prisoner swap. So it's very clear that they actually don't want to have real peace talks. And in terms of this attack, I think it should be pointed out that I saw that in the Western media, they kept emphasizing that Ukraine planned this attack. It was all Ukraine. And I'm very skeptical about that. I think it's very likely that the U.S. military was involved in helping to plan this. And also, I would not be surprised if in a few months, the New York Times publishes an article about how the U.S. military helped Ukraine plan this daring attack. This is a pattern we've seen again and again in the past few years. Ukraine carries out one of these kinds of attacks, and then a few months later, and originally the Western media all obediently says Ukraine did this on its own, and then a few months later it comes out that the U.S. military was behind the attack, and I expect something similar here. So we see that one day Trump will say he wants peace talks, and then they carry out these attacks that the U.S. military is very likely involved in. So if you look at it from the perspective of Russia, why are they negotiating? I mean, this is why I think Trump has also been pretty frustrated because, one, before he even returned to the White House, he claimed that he could end the war in Ukraine. At one point, he said he would end it before he returned to the White House in the lame duck period, Biden's lame duck period. Then he claimed he would end it on his first day. That obviously didn't happen. And now it's looking more and more remote. And I think this reflects a few things. One, Russia recognizes that it's winning the war, and it will probably end up having some kind of military solution at this point. I mean, the Ukrainian military has said there have been reports that the Ukrainian military has had major shortages for well over a year now. This is why we've seen these horrible videos in social media of Ukrainian men just being basically kidnapped on the side of the road. Previously, some of those videos were men who were being conscripted and they were simply not showing up. But now there are reports that they're just random guys that are just being picked up and thrown in a van to be sent to the front line. So clearly, Ukraine has had a major shortage of personnel. There's also a major shortage of ammunition. And the Trump administration has actually continued some of the weapon sales to Ukraine, but they're not at the same scale as they were under Biden. So, I mean, it's clear that Russia won this. And I think the possibility of some kind of diplomatic breakthrough is becoming more and more unlikely, given that Ukraine just carried out this attack and they knew that it would force Russia to respond. I mean, Putin has to respond because, I mean, otherwise he would look weak and the Russian people would be very angry. I want to point out one other quick thing. If I can I share my screen? I think, let me see. Is that okay?
Let's see. Yeah, go ahead.
So Trump has been so inconsistent in his rhetoric as well. So can you share? There we go.
Yes.
So this is a message that Trump posted on Truth Social, his Twitter copy, back in May. This was 2 weeks ago. He said, Putin has gone absolutely crazy. He's needlessly killing a lot of people. And then this is the crazy part. I've always said he wants all of Ukraine, and maybe that's proving right. If he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia. He's threatening to overthrow the Russian government, essentially. I mean, or destroy Russia as a country. I mean, there are different ways you can interpret that, but the downfall of Russia, that's a crazy statement. So it's so hard for foreign leaders to negotiate with the U.S. in general. I mean, every U.S. leader is hypocritical and inconsistent. But in the case of Trump, I mean, it's just so bipolar because Trump, he says he has a good call with Putin, like he just had, allegedly. But then this came after he threatened the downfall of Russia. How can you negotiate in this way?
Yeah, it's, Brian, I mean, those are all great points, Ben. And Brian, there's been something going around, especially among Wall Street circles, and I certainly don't share many viewpoints with Wall Street types, but there's a term for Trump called Trump always chickens out, taco. He's been being called this. And one of the reasons for this has been, of course, the trade war. But if we just look at Ukraine, there has been this so-called push for peace that Trump came in with, and now with these attacks, it seems that these terror attacks by Ukraine are just constant. And the United States under Trump has shown very little interest in actually addressing what Putin and Russia call the root causes of this war. So what's your assessment of this and this idea of Trump constantly kind of waffling, almost backtracking at every turn?
Well, I agree with Ben. The United States was obviously behind this most recent deep drone strike on Russia's strategic bombers. It would be impossible to conduct without extensive U.S. support. The New York Times has revealed over the last 3 years that from 2014 onward, the U.S. completely captured and controls, directs, trains, and builds up Ukraine's intelligence capabilities. The SBU and military intelligence, all of these agencies are being run by the CIA. The CIA has a network of physical bases spanning all of Ukraine, and including all along the border with Russia. The U.S. military since 2022, at least 2022 onward, has been directing Ukrainian military operations. U.S. generals are at the top of the chain of command of Ukraine's armed forces, not Ukrainian commanders, not the president of Ukraine. So Ben's absolutely right about that. This is essentially just another episode of what is a U.S. war on Russia being fought through Ukraine and to a certain extent through Europe. Now, regarding President Trump's claims that he was going to end the war in 24 hours or even before stepping foot into office, he was clearly telling people what they wanted to hear. If people listened carefully, J.D. Vance, even before the Trump administration took office, after winning the election, he openly said that they're going to dump Ukraine onto Europe and pursue the very same type of conflict, only with China, because that is their top priority. There's an article out there somewhere about we shouldn't be wasting weapons on Ukraine. We need them to fight China. And then President Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, back in February, delivered a directive. And I say this every time I come on, in Brussels. He told Europe, you're going to take over You're going to freeze the conflict. You're going to put troops on the ground. You're going to expand arms production. You're going to double down on sending those arms to Ukraine while we pivot to China. This is about division of labor, dividing up the labor of U.S. empire among its European proxies and also its proxies in Asia. And it's also about strategic sequencing. China is the more immediate threat to American primacy over the planet. We can circle back around and get Russia later. We wanted to finish Russia first, then go to China, but that's not possible. So now there's this strategic sequencing taking place. And this is described in corporate funded policy papers published a year, 2 years, 4 years before Trump even contested elections in 2024.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah. Ben. Let's let's talk about. I wanted to actually pull up. Vlad. One of the things actually before I pull it up, I wanted to ask you, Ben, is you've come on the show and you've said the focus for the United States is now on China. But one of the interesting things that keeps happening with the Ukraine conflict is that the United States, despite the rhetoric and despite even all of what Brian has said, like transitioning this conflict to Europe, it seems that the United States is not only very deeply involved, but as you said, with this attack, is like, there were reports that Pete Hegseth was getting direct intelligence about this attack on Russia's bombers as it was happening. And it just seems like the United States is still very deeply not only involved in this conflict, but it seems like there are deep vested interests in keeping it going. What's your response to that?
Yeah, well, again, this is the point I always make when we talk about this, Danny, which is that you have to think about it from the perspective of Russia. If it's in the winning position, obviously, so if they're going to negotiate, what is the leverage that the U.S. has? What are the concessions that the U.S. can make to Russia that would lead to them making some kind of political settlement in a war that they're winning? If there's no political settlement, Russia has already won, but it's going to be completely definite, a complete military victory. So the U.S. has really two main things that it can give Russia. One, it can lift sanctions. Now, first of all, these are unilateral sanctions which violate international law, and Russia also has economically not been doing very badly. There are reports that its economy is slowing down this year, but in the past 2 years, Russia's economy was growing very healthily, faster than the U.S. economy, which the U.S. is running over 6% deficit, 6% of GDP deficits. And in Europe, there are many countries that are stagnant or even potentially in recession. So economically, Russia has been doing quite well. And Russia has been economically integrating more and more with Asia, not only with China, but also with India and even Turkey and other parts of Asia. So the sanctions are, of course, something that Russia would like to see lifted, obviously, but it's not a deal breaker. Like they're not going to sacrifice other interests just to lift the sanctions, given that in many ways, the sanctions have encouraged Russia to be more economically self-sufficient. Russia has been reindustrializing, not only massively expanding military output, but manufacturing output of cars and car parts and machinery. So there's that aspect. And then the other aspect is that Trump says, okay, we'll make some kind of deal. Russia can have, the U.S. will recognize that that Crimea and the Donbass are now part of Russia. But for Russia, that's not even up for negotiation. There are already referenda first of all, Crimea is part of Russia. It has been for over a decade. It was always a bureaucratic move by Khrushchev that made Crimea part of the Ukrainian SSR back when it was all the Soviet Union. It was all the same country. Crimea is part of Russia. It's never been up for negotiation. The Donbass, they already had referenda. These 4 republics in the Donbass are also now part of Russia. From Moscow's perspective, that's not up for negotiation. So, the U.S. doesn't really have much that it can offer other than and Trump also says, okay, we will normalize political relations with you so we can focus on attacking China. Trump said this in October in an interview with Tucker Carlson. He said that he can divide Russia and China. He said confidently that he thought he could do it. Obviously, he has not succeeded. And President Xi Jinping took a trip to Moscow this May to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the end of the European theater of World War II, the Soviet defeat of Nazi Germany, in what in Russia is known as the Great Patriotic War, and what in China is known as the World Anti-Fascist War. And when Xi was in Moscow, he signed an agreement with Putin, an 8,000-word joint statement. And in this, China and Russia reaffirmed in clear terms that their partnership is deep, is as strong as it ever has been. It is at the best stage it has ever been. And they said in that statement that they will not allow foreign powers, third countries, to try to divide them, which was an obvious reference to the U.S. attempt to divide them. So you look at all of the geopolitical aspects, not even just the military aspects, where Russia's clearly winning, despite, these symbolic attacks carried out by Ukraine every few months that don't really do that much damage, but they get a lot of media headlines, which is the main point. But if you look at Russia's winning militarily, but then you look at all of the other geopolitical elements, it's not in Russia's interest to make some kind of deal with the U.S. unless the U.S. can make significant concessions, which Trump is not willing to do. And then you have the issue of Europe, because, as Brian was just discussing, the U.S. is telling Europe, this is your problem. You have to deal with it. So what this means is that these European leaders have all not abandoned this extremely antagonistic line. And from Russia's perspective, it's probably more important to normalize at least economic relations with Europe than with the U.S. Because, the U.S. can lift sanctions on Russia. I already talked about that. That would be helpful, but it's not a deal breaker. But the U.S. and Russia even before 2022, they didn't really do that much trade. Whereas Russia and Western Europe did a lot of trade, especially Central Europe, Germany, of course. And Russia would like to go back to trading with some European countries. It's also not a deal breaker, because if you look at European imports of gas and oil also, for instance, Europe is now importing lots of liquefied natural gas from the US, which is significantly more expensive than Russian pipeline gas and worse for the environment, by the way. And Germany has invested billions of euros in making new terminals to process the liquefied natural gas coming from the US. So what happened with Russia is they simply rerouted that oil and gas to Asia, especially to China and India. But Russia has also been selling it at a discount. So Russia would like to go back to trading with Europe, of course, but then Europe has not abandoned this extremely antagonistic anti-Russia policy. And even if Trump can somehow come to an agreement with Russia, will Europe be party to this agreement? Probably not. If there is some kind of agreement, Europe will not be able to continue waging this war, because the only reason that Ukraine has been able to continue fighting is because of U.S. support. If U.S. support officially ends, and as I mentioned, Trump has withdrawn some of it, but he's still sending weapons. Not as many as Biden, but he's still sending them. If the U.S. completely ends support, the war will have to end. So the question is, will it end with a Russian military victory or some kind of agreement? Will Europe be part of the diplomatic agreement? Probably not, which means that Europe will still have sanctions on Russia. Now, Europe doesn't control the international financial system like the U.S. does, but Europe did trade with Russia before, and Russia's not really concerned about trading with the U.S. The U.S. and Russia are the number 2 largest oil and gas exporters in the world. The U.S. is a deindustrialized country. What is Russia going to buy from it? Russia has all of the oil and gas and minerals and grains and other commodities that it needs. So again, it's just people need to think about it more geopolitically and think about it from Russia's perspective, like what he would get from making some kind of grand bargain with the U.S. Again, this goes back to this idea that Trump constantly reiterates: we have all the cards. No, they don't, actually. The U.S. does not have that many cards at this point. It does have control over the international financial system, but Russia has already created an alternative payment system. Russia is obviously deeply invested in BRICS. The BRICS summit was held last year in Kazan in Russia, and they came to many important new agreements, including plans for offshore because Russia has de-dollarized its trade with China. Over 90% of their bilateral trade is in yuan and rubles. It's de-dollarized its trade with India using rubles and rupees. It's de-dollarized its trade with Iran. So Russia has already done that. And now the issue is dealing with trade imbalances, and they're making offshore commodities exchanges to deal with these trade imbalances. So, I mean, this is the whole point, that these sanctions have actually made Russia more sovereign and self-sufficient. So they're not like begging to end the sanctions either. So again, I think all of the geopolitical momentum is on deepening Russia's integration with Asia. And that's why ultimately they started this whole new phase of the war that goes back to 2014. It was the US that started this war with the coup in Ukraine in 2014, but this new phase in 2022. The whole reason that they initiated this is because they knew that their future lies in integration with Asia, and that the US would never tolerate Russia as an equal peer. It would only tolerate Russia integrating into the West and in the G8 as a subservient vassal like it was under Boris Yeltsin.
Yeah, all of those are good points. Brian, do you want to follow up on anything before we move on?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was exactly what I was going to say. What is the underlying agenda that compels the U.S. to maintain NATO, holds primacy, control over Europe, and use Europe and especially Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, because ultimately wants to subordinate Russia as part of a wider plan to encircle, contain Iran, and ultimately China. And so how can you negotiate with the US? All Russia or China or Iran could do is negotiate to buy time to continue building up this alternative system Ben was describing, and just time out the clock. One thing that I think many people can agree, the United States is still extremely dangerous, has asymmetric capabilities it can use to undermine and destroy, if not Russia, Iran, and China directly, nations all along the periphery. But it's no longer able to use military force to coerce all of these nations directly. What it's doing more and more now is holding peace, prosperity, stability hostage, and using that as leverage over these countries. Telling Russia, if you don't submit to us, China, if you don't do what we tell you, we will destabilize and destroy everything. And if not inside your country, everything along your borders and in your region of the planet. That's what I would like to follow up with. Just that.
Yeah. Well, hey, Danny, can I make one other
sure.
quick point?
Go ahead.
If I can share my screen again. So I mentioned that when President Xi Jinping visited Moscow and met with President Putin, can you share this? So They signed a joint statement. It was over 8,000 words. Now, there's not an official English language translation. I did an article about this, and I'm showing a clip of it. And this is an unofficial English translation that was done by a Chinese journalist who's a friend of mine. And in this joint statement signed by Xi and Putin, they made a very interesting comment that's related to our discussion here. So I talked about this part. The two sides firmly oppose efforts to incite other countries to adopt hostile positions toward Russia and China around the world and to smear China-Russia cooperation. Okay, but this is what's really fascinating about the quote, is they said, China and Russia will strengthen coordination and resolutely respond to the U.S. implementation of dual containment against China and Russia. That was a very important line. And again, this is signed by Putin and Xi, acknowledging that even though, Russian diplomats who are very smart, some of the best diplomats in the world, they know that Trump publicly said he wants to divide Russia and China. And there's been this big debate in Washington about the reverse Kissinger, which, as I point out, actually is not the reverse Kissinger, it's the original Kissinger, because Kissinger himself had advocated back in 1972 when he visited China. He said that in a few decades, the U.S. would have to do the opposite and ally with Russia against China. But the point is that Russian diplomats know that this discussion is happening in Washington. And in that statement, they said that's not going to happen. But they also said that we know that you still want to contain us. It's dual containment. It's not just against China. So I think what this shows is that, there are some people, certainly, the Russiagate Democrats who have always been just living on Mars. This idea that like Trump just loves Russia and he's a Putin puppet. That's obviously absurd. But even now, when Trump is making all of these diplomatic outreaches to Putin, although, as I pointed out earlier, then a few weeks later, he'll post something on Truth Social calling Putin crazy. So it's this very bipolar situation. But he'll say, I had a great call with Putin. I have a great relationship with Putin. But then if you look at the statements that Putin is signing with China, he's making it very clear that they recognize that Russia is still being targeted by the US in a dual containment strategy.
Yeah, no, all great points, Ben. And given this, Brian, I actually wanted to pull up because everything that Ben said has outlined with the dual containment strategy of Russia and China, this larger geopolitical context. It makes me think about recently Vladimir Putin addressed all of Russia after these attacks on Bryansk, Kursk, the bridges, Crimea, Kerch, the Kerch Bridge. Here's what he said, and what he says really, I think, gives pause to this idea that Russia is somehow going to capitulate or surrender its interests for the Trump administration. Here we go. I will read it. So, how to hold such meetings in these conditions, like negotiations he's talking about. What do you talk about? Who even negotiates with those who bet on terror, with terrorists? And why encourage them? Providing respite in the fighting, which will be used to pump up the regime with Western weapons. So this has been something that Russia has been saying from the very beginning. And now that these escalations continue, Brian, talk about, a lot of people are saying, well, Russia should use an Oreshnik. Well, Russia should really step up the pace and accelerate escalation and be sure they send a huge message. But what do you say about this?
Again, why is the U.S. Seeking negotiations? They only seek negotiations when they themselves need to either buy time or create the illusion of seeking diplomacy before they themselves escalate, or have one of their proxies escalate to create distance between themselves and their proxies. And as Ben has mentioned, the Trump administration is not sending nearly as many weapons to Ukraine as in the past. But this is something that I have been covering since 2022, since this conflict began. The U.S. has a finite amount of weapons and ammunition it can send to Ukraine, a finite amount that it can produce annually. It has a global spanning empire, essentially. It needs weapons to facilitate the other wars that it is fueling. Israel could not conduct military operations without a constant flow of U.S. weapons and ammunition. And of course, their military buildup in China. So they are out of weapons. This is something that I said would happen, that whatever they're making monthly from that, which is not a lot, a small percentage of that is still going to Ukraine, and it will continue. This is absolutely everything they have to send. So it's not President Trump is making a conscious decision not to further arm Ukraine. It's because they simply don't have the huge amounts of arms and ammunition to send Ukraine, which is why, again, Secretary Hegseth back in February told Europe, you need to expand production. You need to double down on sending weapons to Ukraine because we can't do it anymore. We need these weapons for China. We need these weapons for Iran and our attempt to reassert primacy over the Middle East. We have three areas that we're focusing on. We cannot do it all by ourselves, so we need our proxies to pitch in. So the other thing I want to point out is this concept of dual containment. Russia and China's awareness of this. A lot of people aren't really sure if they're aware of it or not. Obviously, they're aware of it. And this reflects both Secretary Hegseth's comments in February, where he talked about strategic sequencing and division of labor. And then just at the ShangriLa dialogue in Singapore late last month, he was there talking about, we dumped Ukraine off on Europe, and we're here in Asia. We were distracted for decades, burning down the rest of the world. But now we're ready to get busy here in Asia. And that is essentially what this is all about. It is about dual containment. It's about the U.S. delegating responsibility for this strategy amongst all of these nations that has politically captured and controls, both in Europe, but also here in the Asia-Pacific region. And that is what's actually driving what we see taking place. President Trump had no intention of ever ending the war. It's continuity of agenda. It's exactly where President Biden, who we all know is not making any decisions himself, that's where his administration left off. That's where he picked up. And this is a continuation of what's been going on since the turn of the 21st century. This is the post-Cold War strategy of eliminating all peer and near-peer adversaries or competitors, whatever the U.S. labels these nations as. Nobody's allowed to have independent foreign policy. The planet is America's domain, and it is going to attempt to maintain that control over the planet. And that's where all of this is stemming from.
Yeah, Ben, how is the United States going to be able to get to China per se? Because that's what Hegseth, that's what the Trump administration continues to actually communicate quite clearly, that they really are trying to dump Ukraine onto Europe, for example. They really are trying to move on. Now, West Asia and the Middle East is a bit complicated. There have been reports actually that they're moving more military hardware there supposedly away from Ukraine. And we know how bogged down the United States is allying with and funding Israel. But how is the United States going to, if there is this grand Eldridge Colby and these types, they have this grand strategy for moving toward a conflict with China? How do they do that if they're spread so thin everywhere, including Ukraine?
Well, this is why they've been trying since the Obama administration to have a pivot to Asia, right? This goes back to Obama's first term when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. And in fact, this May, there were two speeches given by Trump administration officials that I think were very important that kind of outline this strategy. One was a speech given by J.D. Vance, the vice president, at the graduation ceremony of the U.S. Naval Academy. And then another speech was given by Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, at the ShangriLa Dialogue, which is the summit that is held every year in Singapore, bringing together military officials and leaders largely from the Asia-Pacific region, although the U.S. always invites itself. And French President Macron was there, even though France is very far from the Pacific. But anyway, at this, I'll start with the Shangri-La Dialogue talk, because that was extremely hawkish. It was crazy. Hegseth said the U.S. is preparing for war. He repeatedly said that. He said China is a threat.
I actually have a clip.
Yeah,
If you
go for it.
A very, very, very brief clip just showing just a bit. It won't be able to cover everything because the speech is actually quite long, I think over 30 minutes, but here is just a portion.
Any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be. The United States does not seek war. We do not seek to dominate or strangle China, to encircle or provoke. We do not seek regime change, nor will we instigate or disrespect a proud and historic culture. We will be ready, but we will not be reckless. Instead, we seek peace. But we must ensure that China cannot dominate us or our allies and partners. Maintaining the status quo requires strength. That's just a rational, common sense goal that we should all be able to live with. And together, we will achieve that peace through strength, reestablishing deterrence, sharing our burdens, multiplying our strengths, reinforcing our great alliances, respecting our cultures, not starting wars, but preventing them, and building a better future for our nations, for our mutual.
So, Ben, I mean, continue, because there he says quite clearly sharing burdens, and he quite and what he's been doing throughout the Trump administration is using peace and deterrence as almost dog whistles for war with China. But your assessment?
Yeah, well, you picked one of the more charitable parts of that speech where he claims that they don't want war and they want peace. I mean, every single empire in history has always claimed that it wants peace, and of course they're not going to say openly they want war. They're going to say we're a force of stability and peace. But I mean, this is even what, you know, Nazi Germany said. Oh, they had to intervene in Poland. They had to annex the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia to save Germans, all that. I mean, this is what every empire says, right? So the US said they had to liberate Afghan women and whatever. So now they said they don't want war. But then you listen to the entire speech and he makes it so clear they're preparing for war. In fact, at the end of the speech, he literally says, this is a quote, "We are preparing for war." That's an exact quote from the speech. And he says we were preparing for war for peace. I mean, it's just the whole Orwellian peace is war thing. So anyway, the point is in that speech, he makes a few important points. One, the US is trying to pressure other countries in Asia to ally with the US against China. He made that very clear. And this was given in Singapore. And I think a lot of it was targeted at the ASEAN countries and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. But ASEAN, excluding the Philippines, every other country in the region has actually maintained a non-aligned foreign policy. And most countries still have very good relations with China. In fact, a poll was done last year that asked people in ASEAN if they were forced to pick a side, if they could only pick either China or the US. A slim majority said China for the first time. And a lot of that was because of the war in Gaza, right? I mean, US support for Israel, and especially in Muslim majority countries in the region, like Indonesia, which is the most populous country in the region, well over 200 million people. The vast majority of people in Indonesia said they prefer China. So this US strategy of targeting ASEAN is not going to work, but that was part of the attempt of his speech. Another important part of his speech was saying that supposedly there will be a war over Taiwan. Now, and he made a few comments in that speech that were obviously supportive of secessionist forces and violate the spirit of the one China policy or the one China principle. When the US normalized relations with the People's Republic of China in the 1970s, it acknowledged the one China policy. There is one China and Taiwan is part of China. And yet he keeps making these comments saying China is going to invade Taiwan. It's like, is the US going to invade Florida? I mean, Taiwan is part of China. What does that mean? So this is this propaganda we constantly hear again and again and again. So what it really means is that the US supports secessionism, and that the US this is why the US has been giving billions of dollars of weapons to Taiwanese separatist forces, because they are preparing for a war with the mainland through Taiwan. And a lot of people have compared it to Ukraine, but it's very different at the same time, because Ukraine is not part of Russia. Taiwan is part of China. So this is an issue for China to deal with. This is China's internal affair. Why is the US telling the world to prepare for war over Taiwan? This is outrageous. And in Beijing, the people were really angry with this very heated speech, because basically he's saying that the US is preparing for war. Now, another part of that speech was also outrageous. He told countries in the region, he calls it the Indo-Pacific, which is part of this US attempt to rebrand the region. It's actually the Asia-Pacific, but only the US calls it Indo-Pacific because they're trying to also bring in India. And even India is not, I mean, they are a partner of the US, but India also has a non-aligned foreign policy. So India is complicated. But the point is that another part of the speech was that Pete Hegseth basically told countries in the region that they cannot have deep economic ties with China. He said, if you have security relations with the US, you cannot trade significantly with China, because he said if there's some kind of conflict, that will complicate our strategic decision making. So he went to Singapore to tell countries in the region, stop trading with China because we're preparing for war in China. I mean, it's just so crazy.
Well, Brian, it gets back then to what Putin originally said in the speech that I played, that why then would Russia, for example, settle for some kind of peace with Ukraine when it's backed by the United States, and the United States is behaving like this toward China? I mean, and of course, the examples can go on and on about the lack of trustworthiness of the other side. And yet, what we've seen, I think, is both Russia and China um, operate in a very, I think, a very diplomatic manner, maneuvering this. Your thoughts on what Ben said and this?
Yeah, Ben is absolutely right. I want to kind of dive a little deeper into Secretary Hegseth's speech. This ShangriLa dialogue is hosted by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. It's based in London, has nothing to do with Asia. And if you go to its website, look at who the top sponsors are: Airbus, BAE, Boeing, General Atomics, Rolls-Royce, which makes airplane engines, Lockheed Martin. If you scroll down, you'll see Northrop Grumman, BGR Group, Chevron, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all corporate financier interests from the West, the modern day manifestation of generations of Western imperialism and colonization here in the Asia-Pacific region. Imagine President Macron from France, who had colonized part of the region, coming here and talking about the West and Asia and maintaining the status quo. Secretary Hegseth also said this: the status quo. What is the status quo? It is Western hegemony over Asia, the West helping itself to this region at the expense of the people who actually live here. So that's one. Secretary Hegseth said the U.S. is not encircling or provoking China. And yet, if you listen to the whole speech, most of the speech is him bragging about how much military equipment, troops, and interoperability the U.S. is creating closer to Chinese shores than to U.S. shores. These are U.S. troops, tens of thousands of them, expanding their military footprint closer to China than they are to the United States. But he began the speech by saying, we need to secure our own backyard first. And he begins talking about the Panama Canal. And he claims that China had malign influence over the Panama Canal, which is 1,700 plus kilometers from the closest point in the continental United States. The Panama Canal doesn't belong to the U.S. It was transferred to Panama back in 1999. And so he's saying that is an unacceptable, that's unacceptable Chinese influence in America's backyard. And then he's describing this massive military buildup of the United States right along China's borders, much, much closer to China than the Panama Canal is to the United States. And one last thing, he said, he says the U.S. doesn't want war, and Ben touched on this. The U.S. doesn't want war, but the U.S. has been at constant war the entire 21st century. It's not been a day the U.S. has not been bombing somebody somewhere on planet Earth. And China, throughout the entire 21st century, has not waged war against anyone. Have not fired a single shot at another nation. And so and then at one point, he even admits that. He said, we were distracted for a generation in wars and regime change. And he's talking about the Middle East, of course, the ongoing proxy war the U.S. triggered in Ukraine. And now he's saying, now we're coming back to Asia. To do what? To do the exact same thing to Asia that the U.S. has done around the entire planet. He's talking about how prosperous and secure and stable Asia is, while admitting the U.S. has been distracted from the region for a generation. So why do you think there's all this peace, prosperity, and stability in Asia? Because the U.S. has not been involved as deeply here in Asia Pacific as it has around the rest of the world, which it is demonstrably burning to the ground. So what his message to the Asia Pacific region is, you're next. We're coming to Asia Pacific. We're going to hold peace, security, and stability hostage unless you do what we tell you. And I forget whether it was Danny or Ben, you talked about him forcing the region basically to make a choice. So you either pick security cooperation with us, which means turning yourself into the next Ukraine, or you can have economic cooperation with China. So they're always saying we're not forcing anyone to make a decision, but he literally used the word insist, and having difficult discussions, which means you need to do what we tell you. And this was his message to Asia. And unfortunately, many of the people in the audience, not all of them, but many people in the audience, and I know people here in Thailand where I'm based, where that message resonates, because they have this desperate, deep desire to be accepted by the West, and they just don't see the big picture. That's the unfortunate part of all of this.
Yeah, and Danny, if I can add, there was a crazy moment at the Shangri-La Dialogue, this summit held in Singapore, although as Brian correctly pointed out, it's sponsored by this hawkish British think tank funded by Western corporations. But in this meeting, the defense minister of the Philippines was present. Teodoro is his last name. And he was interviewed by Chinese journalists, and he went off on them. He started yelling at these Chinese journalists, and he called them Chinese intelligence agents with no evidence whatsoever. These are journalists I know, by the way. They're just like these young journalists. They do good work. And he not only did he call them Chinese intelligence agents, but then the Philippine government created these crazy like meme propaganda posters with the faces of these Chinese journalists saying like warning Chinese intelligence agents, like military intelligence. It was juvenile. It was crazy seeing a government do this to these poor like 20-something Chinese journalists who were just like so taken aback by it. And it went viral on Chinese social media, these clips of this Philippine defense minister yelling at them. And this is the only country in the region that is like volunteering to become the Ukraine of the Asia Pacific region. The U.S. the U.S. military is using 9 bases in the Philippines. The U.S. has installed a missile system in the northern part of the Philippines called the Dhaiphong missile system that has a range of nearly 2,000 kilometers. It can hit the vast majority of the cities in mainland China. And yet the U.S. says we want peace, even though in the same speech, literally in the same speech, he said, quote, "We are preparing for war," end quote. But then he says we want peace. And also, by the way, I forgot to make one other quick point. In that speech, Hegseth claimed in the clip you showed, he said, "We do not want to encircle China." That is objectively false. That is a lie. I did a video about this, and I pointed out that Bloomberg published an article based on comments made by Scott Bessent, the billionaire hedge fund manager who's the Treasury Secretary. And Bessent said that the U.S. has what Bloomberg reported on. They called it a grand encirclement strategy. And Bessent acknowledged that the U.S. is trying to pressure India, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and also Vietnam, good luck with that, to ally with the U.S. against China. So Bloomberg is reporting on these comments made by Bessent saying the U.S. has a grand encirclement strategy, and then Hegseth says we don't have an encirclement strategy. I mean, and I pointed out, by the way, in this video that I did, this isn't just the Trump administration. In the Biden administration, Antony Blinken also said, yeah, this is this Bloomberg article. So Bessent says it's a grand encirclement plan, and then Hegseth says we're not trying to encircle China. And I pointed out, yeah, so here's this article in Bloomberg. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and India as a grand encirclement strategy. Bessent said we can approach China as a group. So that claim is objectively false. But I pointed out that it's not just the Trump administration. If you go back to the Biden, I mean, of course, if you go back to the Obama administration, but if you go back to the Biden administration, Antony Blinken gave an important speech in 2022 outlining the Biden administration's China policy. It was a very hawkish speech as well, although it wasn't as cartoonishly aggressive as Hegseth. He didn't say we're preparing for war. But, Blinken in his characteristic, liberal interventionist, rules-based international order rhetoric, he said that the U.S. is working to, quote, shape the strategic environment around Beijing, end quote. What does that mean? Shape the strategic environment around China? That means containment. It's just a euphemism for containment. So this has been the U.S. policy under Democrats, and it's, of course, continuing under Republicans, because this has been the U.S. strategy. This is the U.S. empire strategy for over a decade.
Yeah, definitely. And Brian, do you have anything you want to follow up on that? Because, we've talked about on this show the massive footprint. I mean, we just talked about on this show not too long ago the massive military drills that the United States was holding with the Philippines. This isn't an aberration. This is exactly what Ben said. This is a consistent policy that actually grows larger and larger. And Pete Hegseth says quite explicitly that they want to move. That's what a big part of that speech was, is they want to move the United States' capabilities to the Asia Pacific, and then they want to burden share by essentially increasing the military expenditures of these countries, just like what they did to Ukraine, and create all kinds of militaries, all kinds of armies that the United States can get involved with and encircle China. But what's your take on all of this?
Well, absolutely. And we have to remember, all of these capabilities Secretary Hegseth is bragging the U.S. is encircling China with across the Asia-Pacific region. These were all put in place during the 4 years President Biden was in office, the 4 years before that Trump was in office. And this all began under the pivot to Asia under the Obama administration. So people who keep voting, thinking that one candidate from one party or the other is going to change anything. No, because the same list of corporate interests that are funding forums like this are the same ones that control policy in Washington, regardless of who's in the White House or who controls Congress. I want to touch on something that Ben mentioned, the Philippines and this absurd attitude that these officers in the Philippine military have, this servile obedience, this eagerness to throw themselves at the feet of the United States. Philippines, we keep hearing about how China is threatening the Philippines. Philippines was literally a colony of the United States from 1898, when they took over from Spain, to 1946, and they've only had de facto independence since then. The United States has maintained political control over the Philippines ever since, up to and including today. It was like a brief period of time under President Duterte where they were trying to reassert their interests, balance their ties. People don't know this because they don't look into any of this stuff. The Philippines has a much larger population than Thailand. It has a much smaller GDP, and it's specifically because it is being turned into a forward operating base by the United States instead of cooperating with the rest of the region and together with China to rise with everybody else. And when I talk about the colonization of the Philippines, if you go to the State Department's own Office of the Historian website under the Philippine-American War, the United States, they talk about how they were burning entire villages, implementing civilian reconcentration policies, putting them in concentration camps, and employing torture. So nothing under the sun has changed since then. Up until now, this is how the U.S. has always conducted its business, and this is how it has treated its so-called ally. And that is an example for the entire region to look at. That's what's going to happen to you. Ukraine is what's going to happen to you if you allow yourself to be pulled into America's orbit, not because they're going to help you or offer an alternative. Listen to Secretary Hegseth. He's talking about either security cooperation with us or economic cooperation with China. He didn't say security and economic cooperation with the U.S. The U.S. has no alternative to offer any of these countries or the island province of Taiwan. They are setting it up to be destroyed, just like Ukraine. And in the think tank papers planning all of this out, they admit everything is going to be scoured off the surface of the island. Nothing's going to be left. And the goal here is not to save Taiwan. It's to use it to cost China. And I just want to point out that the U.S. is using proxies like Ukraine against Russia, Taiwan against the rest of China, the Philippines against China, to degrade strategic capabilities so that if there is a direct conflict between the U.S. and either one of these countries, they will be depleted when it happens. That is part of the strategy. This is part of their thought process doing all of this.
Yeah, and if I can add really quickly, I agree strongly with what Brian said, and I'll add, in terms of Philippine domestic politics, let's not forget, during the first Cold War, we're now in Cold War II, but during Cold War I, the Philippines was a major U.S. proxy, and it was governed by this brutal military dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., and his son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., historical deja vu. His son is now the leader of the Philippines again, and is this obedient U.S. puppet. And it's not just ideological, but it's also obviously simply corruption. I mean, it's well known that the Marcos family is extremely corrupt. Marcos Sr. and his wife stole billions of dollars, and the U.S. not only tolerated but facilitated that corruption. This is how the U.S. empire works. You know, they facilitate corruption, give all this money to these corrupt oligarchs who govern on their behalf and turn their countries into these like neo-colonial proxies. And in the case of what happened to the previous president, Duterte, who tried to maintain a kind of more non-aligned foreign policy, you know, he still had relations with the US that were decent, but he also significantly improved relations with China. What happened recently, Marcos essentially used the International Criminal Court to imprison his main political opponent. And Marcos, what he did was, honestly, it was in a very Machiavellian way. It was pretty smart. He made a political alignment with Duterte's daughter, who was his vice president, and then he completely betrayed them and used, basically, I mean, in the Philippines, this has been a huge controversy, because what essentially Marcos, with the backing of Washington, is doing is using the ICC as a political tool to eliminate his main domestic political rival. Meanwhile, Benjamin Netanyahu, who has an ongoing arrest warrant for crimes against humanity committed in Gaza, he's flying to the US frequently. He's going across European airspace. The Europeans that claim to support the rules-based international order are doing nothing. The Netherlands, where the ICC is located, is doing nothing, making it clear that the ICC is only for people from Africa and Asia, not for Western leaders, and Israel is part of the collective West. So Netanyahu, there's going to be zero consequences for Netanyahu, not to mention Biden and Trump and Obama and Bush, zero consequences for them. But now the US, which is not even a member of the ICC, is allowing its proxy in the Philippines to weaponize the ICC to imprison his main political rival, while he continues to destroy his country and turn it into the Ukraine of Asia. I mean, it's outrageous. And the only silver lining in all of this is that if you look at Marcos's opinion ratings, he's one of the least popular leaders in the world. And people in the Philippines obviously are furious about what's going on. But I mean, this is not surprising, considering, look at all the U.S. allies around the world. Look how popular Zelensky is. I mean, obviously not popular at all, which is why he had to cancel elections and illegalize most political parties.
Yeah. I'd like to pivot now to the Trump-Xi phone call that occurred on June 5th, as of this recording. But I wanted to play or show the lead up to this. So, Brian, to begin with you, I mean, you know, in a matter of a couple of days, you had Donald Trump say this on his Truth Social. He likes President Xi of China, but he's very tough and extremely hard to make a deal with. And not a day later, he engages in a phone call with Xi Jinping, and the readouts. This is what passes for readouts now in the White House on Truth Social. This is what he had to say. Spoke for an hour and a half. He seems to like to do that. There can be no longer any questions respecting the complexity of rare earth products. They'll meet shortly. Their teams, China and US, will meet at a location to be determined. They will be represented by Besant and Lutnick and Greer. They were invited to China. They have a lot to look forward to. It seemed very gracious, Brian. And what's interesting about this is this seems to be a pattern. Trump goes very tough in rhetoric, uses his words as bullyism, and then almost within when the policies actually start rolling through, he ends up having to walk back quite a bit. Brian, what's your reaction to this?
If people remember, during his first 4 years in office, he did something very similar. He talked positively about President Xi Jinping in China, President Putin in Russia. But then what were his actual policies? The U.S. is basically waging a slow motion proxy war, economic war, a campaign of political subversion within both of these countries, destabilizing the periphery, fueling wars from Ukraine and Syria against Russia. And here in Asia, the U.S. is behind the violence in Myanmar, right on China's border, and it is behind the Philippines and all of this growing tension between the Philippines and China. And of course, there were U.S. troops during the first Trump administration on the island province of Taiwan, U.S. troops occupying what is recognized as Chinese territory. So people need to stop listening to what President Trump is saying and just ignore it. It flip-flops constantly. There's nothing to gain from it. All you do is confuse and distract yourself from the one single plan that continues to roll forward, again, throughout his 4 years, Biden's 4 years, and now this current administration is the same plan, and it's going to continue regardless. He's talking about this. He wants to appear, and this is, again, in the think tank policy papers, U.S. wants to appear to be the reasonable one and wants to depict nations like Russia, Iran, and China as irrational, belligerent, and as President Trump said in his social media post, impossible to deal with. And I think someone was talking about an article. I didn't read it. Maybe it's true, maybe not. They claimed that President Xi just reads official statements during his phone calls with President Trump. And why does he do that? Because if that is what he's doing, and it would be funny if that was what he was doing, because there is actually nothing to talk about with whoever is the president of the United States. They're not listening to you. They're talking at you. And whatever they're claiming at the time is irrelevant if it diverges from the actual plan that the U.S. is actually pursuing regarding these countries. The bottom line is the U.S. will not tolerate China's rise. It's surpassing the collective West. And they have said this on numerous occasions throughout every single administration. They will not tolerate a China that surpasses the U.S., despite the reality that China has a larger population, a larger industrial base, access to plenty of resources, graduating millions more in science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And by right, they should have a stronger, more powerful nation than the United States. Just like the U.S. has a stronger, more powerful nation than, say, the United Kingdom or Portugal. And imagine if Portugal was threatening to destabilize the entire planet because the U.S. had surpassed them economically and militarily. So this is what is actually happening, and people are myopically focusing on what President Trump is saying or what President Biden had been saying, and they're not looking at the big picture and the actual trajectory this is all on. So he's talking about these tariffs. This was an attempt to, and I think they're going to continue doing this. It's to isolate China's economy, an attempt to do so. It's also to decouple the U.S. economy, no matter how much pain is involved, from China before the war they're obviously preparing for. Because if a war erupts and they're still heavily dependent on China, it will completely destroy the U.S. economy. They're trying to mitigate that as much as possible before hostilities may begin.
Yeah, and destroy the U.S. economy before the war begins, I guess. But Ben, yeah, comment on this, because you've been covering the trade war quite deeply, and of course it continues despite the Geneva accords, whatever we want to call them. And the Chinese readout was what you'd expect it to be after the Trump-Xi phone call. So your assessment on where we are at here, because it was Donald Trump who was building up toward this kind of break, needing to call Xi Jinping. Well, why did he need to call him, Ben?
Yeah, well, it was Trump who started this whole conflict through his trade war. This goes back to 2018 when he first started the trade war in China, and then Biden continued it. So it is bipartisan. Again, it's not just Trump. But when Trump came back in April, he announced tariffs on China, tariffs on the entire world. he paused the tariffs on the rest of the world, and he massively increased those tariffs on China to 145%, which is crazy. That was basically a trade embargo. And then there was this temporary 90-day pause after the talks were held in Switzerland between Scott Bessent and his Chinese counterpart. However, the big issue now is over rare earths. And you read that statement, Danny, in which Trump talked about the issue of rare earth elements. Now, this is a big problem for the U.S. because Trump claims that the U.S. has all the cards. And as has been pointed out in many memes, China makes those cards. And not only does China make the cards, China processes all of the minerals needed for the machines that make the cards, right? So, for instance, today, the vast majority of advanced electronics not only need, certain critical minerals like lithium, but they also need rare earth elements and magnets that China processes. Now, rare earths are kind of misunderstood because they're not actually that rare, but it's difficult to find them in very dense concentration, and it's even more difficult to process them. China is the world leader in processing rare earths, and the U.S. has a very little role in the supply chain for rare earth elements. And China is the vast, vast majority, like 90%. So what happened is that when the U.S. put semiconductor restrictions on China, which, again, this is bipartisan. It's not just Trump. It goes back to Trump's first term, but also Biden. Trump and Biden both expanded restrictions on the export of advanced semiconductors, chips, to China, because the U.S. strategy is to try to prevent China from developing artificial intelligence technology. Now, obviously, that strategy did not work because you have this Chinese company, DeepSeek, made a very important scientific breakthrough, creating large language models, AI models, that are just as good, if not better, than the models made by US companies like OpenAI, which should be renamed Closed AI, because DeepSeek is actually OpenAI. DeepSeek released its models for free, open source, for the entire world to use. So-called OpenAI does not release its models open source. And by the way, OpenAI is 49% owned by Microsoft. But anyway, the point is that Trump in his first term and then Biden put these restrictions on the export of semiconductors to China to try to prevent China from catching up technologically. Biden's Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, she admitted that the U.S. goal was to prevent China from innovating. She said that. And then she also said that the U.S. would do whatever it takes, that's a quote, whatever it takes to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced technologies. Because the idea that the U.S. had is that if they can keep China 2 or 3 years behind the U.S. in the development of AI, they thought that the U.S. would have a monopoly on AI. This was also spelled out by another major corporate leader in the U.S., who is the CEO of Anthropic, which is the second most important U.S. AI company after so-called OpenAI. Anthropic has as two major investors, Amazon and Google. So it claims to be a startup, but two of its big backers are Amazon and Google. And the CEO, Dario Amodei, wrote an article in which he said that this is about geopolitics, not just about AI. He said, if the US can maintain control over AI through export restrictions on chips, then the US can maintain a unipolar world. That's what he wrote openly. The Silicon Valley oligarch backed by Amazon and Google. He said the goal is to maintain a US-controlled unipolar world. And he said that in order to do that, the US has to impose chip export restrictions on China to prevent China from getting access to the most high-end chips, to prevent China from catching up to the US in AI development. And he warned that if China can get access to chips and develop AI, we will live in a multipolar world. Gasp! Such horror. And of course, he doesn't want to live in a multipolar world. As a U.S. Silicon Valley oligarch, he wants to live in a unipolar world. So how does this relate to rare earths? Well, the U.S. is waging a brutal tech war on China, not just an economic war. And in response to that U.S. tech war and the export restrictions on China, Beijing responded by restricting the export of rare earths to the U.S. This was a proportional move made in self-defense. It was not a unilateral aggressive act by China, which is what the U.S. is portraying it as. Rather, China's message is clear. Lift the export restrictions you have on us, and we will lift the export restrictions we have on you. But what has the Trump administration done now in its second term? It has continued to tighten the export restrictions on China. And now, in fact, there are reports that Washington is telling other countries, especially Singapore, stop selling semiconductors to China. So basically, the US is telling the entire world, you cannot trade with China, at least when it comes to advanced technologies like chips, or we will also put sanctions and restrictions on you. This is a global tech war, a global economic war. So China is responding by restricting the export of rare earths. So until this issue is resolved, I mean, it's not some kind of like, China is not the aggressive one here. The US is the aggressor. And until it's resolved, I do not expect some kind of short-term solution, because it's very reasonable for China to have this position. One other quick point. The irony is that there are some corporate forces in Silicon Valley who are actually angry about this, especially NVIDIA. Well, actually, NVIDIA is not in Silicon Valley, but in the extended metaphorical Silicon Valley. NVIDIA, which is the world's leading designer of chips, of advanced semiconductors, NVIDIA actually is really angry because they're losing billions of dollars in sales in the Chinese market, because China had previously been their major market. And now, because of the US export restrictions, not only are they not able to sell many of these chips to China, but China is massively investing in its own research to develop advanced semiconductors. China has its own companies. The main company is called SMIC, the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, and they're making a lot of progress. China is already the world's leader in what they call legacy chips, which are not the most advanced semiconductors, but all of like the lesser advanced semiconductors, the vast majority of them are designed and manufactured by China. And what this is all really about now is a fight over the most high-end chips. And Xiaomi, the major Chinese company, just released new technology with a 3-nanometer chip in it, which is a huge breakthrough. A little bit over a year ago, there was another huge breakthrough when Huawei released a phone, the Mate 60 Pro, that had a 7-nanometer chip. Now they have 3-nanometer chips. So this is why in Washington, instead of lifting the export restrictions, they're putting more and more export restrictions on China, which is it's incentivizing China to invest more and more in the domestic production of chips. So at the end of the day, like the US sanctions on Russia, all this is doing is accelerating the move toward more sovereignty and independence economically in China. And this whole rare earth issue, it's probably not going to be resolved, because that is the fundamental issue, is the US tech war, which Trump didn't mention, of course.
Yeah, and Brian, the reports were right before the Trump Xi phone call were that the auto industry in the United States was panicking because there's these magnets that have a lot to do with this whole supply chain. It's really a supply chain war that Ben outlined there, which it was set to heavily and it is still heavily affecting the United States' own economic state. But I'm curious your assessment on the military component of this too, because you've been arguing that the trade war, tariff war, is a military component, and it's not. It's ironic that the Trump administration has been so furious with China about these rare earths, in large part because not only does it have these minerals have a huge part to play in tech and all kinds of industries in the U.S., but also the military. So your thoughts about this big freakout that is, I think, showing a lot about the state of the U.S.'s war on China.
Well, first, I think Ben brought up what was probably one of the most important aspects of all of this. This essentially an arms race regarding artificial intelligence. A lot of people don't really understand this. It's a relatively new topic. The Western media doesn't really explain it to the public well, but I think this is probably the most pivotal battle that is taking place right now. And everything Ben talked about regarding the U.S. trying to control semiconductors, everything that it's doing with tariffs, military, encirclement, containment, these are all part of one single strategy that is being waged across the entire spectrum. It's not just military, diplomatic, political. It's everything across the spectrum, everything in between. The United States talking about restricting China, competing with China, building up its own industrial base to outproduce China. People have to understand it's not just about building more factories in the United States. It's also about the supply chains. As Ben talked about, the raw materials are being processed primarily by China, not the US. The US would have to develop all of this, not just develop it to begin with, but then expand it to the same scale China is operating at. But it's even beyond that. It's about human resources, your education system, and the US is lagging behind that. It's going to take almost a generation to catch up with that. It's also about infrastructure. If you don't have the right infrastructure in place, your industries are going to suffer and lag behind. The United States sees artificial intelligence. People have to understand this is something that is right at the edge of moving into what they call general intelligence, artificial general intelligence, which is artificial intelligence as smart as a human, and then will increasingly become smarter than any human being, be able to problem solve, reason, create, imagine. They believe this is going to, if they could achieve this first, this is going to give them an exponential advantage. It's a force multiplier over China, no matter what all of its advantages are. So this is why they're so desperately trying to starve China of semiconductors. It's kind of bizarre that they're trying to do a brain drain, but also blocking Chinese citizens from coming to the U.S. and researching and studying. Yeah. It's panic has set in. And if China were to win this AI arms race, just as Ben said, people don't understand. AI, we're at a crossroads here. We're either going to have a science fiction utopia civilization with a balance of power and we're all enjoying the benefits, or the US is going to use it to enhance the control, the exploitation, the inequality that has punctuated Western civilization for generations. They will take that and they will supercharge it on scales unimaginable to ordinary people. So this is where we are. This is the crossroads. People need to understand this. I've wanted to talk about this, but I'm just struggling just to get people to understand you can't vote for Trump and get him to change and fight the deep state. He is the deep state, but I can't get people to understand that. How can we talk about an artificial intelligence arms race, generative AI, how it works and how quickly it's advancing, the implications. So it's very important to have these conversations and start to get people on board with this and understand this. And unfortunately, just as Ben was saying, that the U.S. is acting as if China just out of nowhere said, we're not sharing rare earth minerals with you anymore, just because China is evil. But as he pointed out, it's because of the semiconductor restrictions and everything else the U.S. has been doing to China, and China's been very patiently enduring. This is how the U.S. does everything. They're encircling China, and then when China carries out a military buildup to respond to it, the U.S. pretends as if this just came out of nowhere, and this is China being belligerent. So it's something that is continuous, and it's being done all along the spectrum.
And Ben, before you, if you have another comment, I just wanted to say that what China's doing with rare earths is it's China's rare earth. So what the United States does is it superimposes extrajudicially all kinds of sanctions and tariffs. It's not protecting its own industries because, as our friend Michael Hudson has said, the United States has turned itself into a trade-dependent country by essentially selling off all of its industry. But what it does to China is extrajudicial. It's about reaching out and trying to squash and contain China's economy. What China is doing with rare earths, yes, it is a hit. It is a move, but it is also China's right to trade its own rare, or to exchange and to produce and to process its own rare earth minerals how it wants. No, that's your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I would use a word that's become a very popular word among Trump supporters, which is reciprocal. They say that Trump's tariffs are supposedly reciprocal, which, by the way, they're not reciprocal. When Trump announced these tariffs on so-called Liberation Day on the 2nd of April, he used this crazy formula that was not based on the tariff rate charged by other countries on the U.S., but rather was based on the U.S. trade deficit with that country. So the larger the U.S. trade deficit with a country, the larger the tariffs, which is why the U.S. put insanely high tariffs on Cambodia, a very poor country, because the U.S. does not buy that much from Cambodia, but Cambodia exports to the U.S. So the U.S. has a trade deficit with Cambodia, and they put huge tariffs on Cambodia. It's not because Cambodia has 40% tariffs on the U.S. It's false. So Trump's claim of reciprocal tariffs is a lie. They were not reciprocal. They were unilateral. But China's rare earth export restriction on the U.S. is reciprocal. It is a reciprocal export restriction made in response to the unilateral U.S. export restriction. We need this kind of idea, turning everything on its head, this propaganda. It's so similar to what happened with Israel and Iran. Remember when Israel attacked Iran's consulate in Syria, which, according to international law, was an Israeli attack on Iranian territory, because a country's embassy or consulate is their diplomatic territory. It is their territory according to international law. Israel attacked Iran, and then Iran responded with a reciprocal attack in self-defense against Israel. And the US and the Western media all said that Iran launched this aggressive attack on Israel. It's so similar to what's happening with China. The US attacks China, China responds, and then the US says China is being aggressive and unreasonable, but it's actually China, like Iran, that is being reciprocal.
Yeah, indeed. Well, how about we get to just a few questions from the audience before we close up the program? Does that sound all right? There's a few good ones, actually, topics that we haven't been able to tackle. Here is kind of a combined question. I'm just going to pull it up. So first, what's the deal with Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger getting together? Will Nigeria join them? Will Cote d'Ivoire free itself from neocolonialism and join them? And then there's this one that's related. Is President Trump against Ibrahim Traore, who's the leader of Burkina Faso? If so, does he think Traore will charge too much for gold, which could be used for Trump's golden dome? So big questions here. How about you, Brian? How about you begin with wherever you want to answer those?
Well, I think we can see, as this shift in the global balance of power takes place, we can see areas the U.S. and Europe previously dominated, their influence over these areas is fading. And why is it fading? Why are these countries in Africa increasingly asserting their own interests, the interests of the people who actually live there, over the interests of the United States and Europe and all the corporations there that have been exploiting the continent for generations and generations? It's because countries like Russia and China are coming in there and they're actually developing the region. Yes, they're developing the region to facilitate trade and the extraction of raw materials that they need for their economies. But they're not just extracting it and killing everybody and dividing and destroying everybody and keeping everyone divided and destitute. They're actually coming in there and helping develop these regions. And we're going to see a lot of these countries start to band together. They're going to work more closely with Russia and China, also with each other, as more and more of them slip out from under the shadow of U.S. and European domination. It's going to be unpleasant. It's going to take a long time. And the United States has openly declared that AFRICOM, the U.S. doesn't. Its military doesn't divide its areas of responsibility within the United States. It divides it around the entire globe, and they have a command specifically for the continent of Africa. Just think about that at face value, what the implications are. And they're going to continue fighting. The way they fight is by politically interfering, undermining and overthrowing governments, funding terrorism while pretending to fight terrorism as a pretext to maintain their military across the continent. And they will be burning while China and Russia try to build, and it's all going to be determined by whether the multipolar world can build itself up faster than the U.S. can burn it down.
Yeah.
Yes, Ben, please. Sorry.
Yeah, I can respond. So I'll talk about the two questions. I'll start with the Golden Dome. I think there's a bit of a misconception here. So the Golden Dome doesn't really involve gold. The Golden Dome is called that because it's based on Israel's Iron Dome. And as always, the U.S. wants to one-up everything so that, oh, you have iron. Well, ours is gold. But it's not made of gold. It's a missile defense system. And the idea is that, the U.S. is preparing for war. And even though it's very unlikely that there will be a lot of attacks on the U.S. directly, I mean, the U.S. it has two oceans on each side of it. Anyway, so Trump wants to create a missile defense system. He's planning on spending, he says, $175 billion. We'll see. And he's already, at least he was making plans to give $25 billion in contracts to Elon Musk's companies. Although now Musk and Trump are fighting, which was completely predictable. It would happen eventually. And it is very funny seeing Elon Musk go out and tweet saying, I spent $300 million electing Trump. If it weren't for me, he wouldn't have won, and all this. Anyway, so the point is that Trump wants to create a missile defense system based on Israel's Iron Dome. It doesn't have to do with gold, and it doesn't have to do with West Africa. But in terms of Burkina Faso, which, as the questioner pointed out, is a major gold producer, and Mali and Niger, these are some of the poorest countries in the world. But every year they export billions of dollars of gold. We should ask, why is this? This is crazy. They export billions of dollars of gold while a huge part of their population does not have electricity and lives in extreme poverty. And it's because the proceeds of that gold were not going to benefit the people of these countries. They were going to benefit multinational corporations, especially French mining companies, British mining companies, and they were going to benefit elites of these countries. And this is why you had these revolutionary military governments that took power in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. In Burkina Faso, the leader is this young military leader, Ibrahim Traoré, who's inspired by the revolutionary socialist leader of Burkina Faso, the late leader, Thomas Sankara, who was killed in a coup backed by the U.S. I believe it was 1987, back in the 1980s. And Sankara was influenced by Che Guevara, the Argentine Cuban revolutionary leader. And that's why Thomas Sankara was often referred to as the Che Guevara of Africa. And under his revolutionary policies in the 80s, first of all, he created Burkina Faso as a country. That's where the name comes from. And he invested significantly in poverty reduction, education, healthcare, women's equality, public health, infrastructure projects. And then he was killed in this coup, and a corrupt pro-Western leader came to power. So what's happening now is that Ibrahim Traoré is invoking this legacy, this revolutionary legacy of Thomas Sankara. And in particular, as the questioner pointed out, he has been emphasizing sovereign control over Burkina Faso's natural resources, especially gold. And what we've seen in the Sahel, in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, is the nationalization of some of these mines and these strategic interests, so the governments can use the export revenue to fund social programs and invest in their people, which is what previous governments should have done. But of course, they were corrupt, Western proxies. Now, why did they form a federation? Well, because a few things. One, because they'll be stronger unified, obviously. So they created a Sahel federation of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. But also because another factor is that their currency is still a French colonial currency that is called the CFA franc, which, by the way, the name of that used to be Colonial France Afrique. It used to literally be the colonial French African franc was the name of the currency. It had colonial in the name. They renamed it to be the community, but it's a colonial currency. And what's funny is France doesn't even use the franc anymore. France uses the euro, but they still impose this colonial currency on a dozen West African countries. So Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have been trying to create an alternative, and they hope to, by unifying, they can create a new currency bloc, which is an alternative to the CFA franc. And then the other major reason for this federation is that they have huge issues with extremist groups, with Al-Qaeda affiliates, groups like Al-Shabaab. And you have to ask, the US military and the French military were very active in this region. They had troops and military bases in this region for decades, and yet they failed to defeat these extremist groups. And you have to ask, did they really want to defeat them, or did they want to allow them to permanently exist at a low scale to justify nonstop military occupation? Because it's like, I remember one time I went to a conference and I heard a representative of a pharmaceutical company who said that they don't want to cure cancer. They just want to treat cancer, because if they cure cancer, they lose all of that business if you have a cure. He said it openly. And it's similarly in the case of the French and US military forces. If they defeat these extremist groups, which, by the way, you can never really fully defeat them. Even if you defeat them militarily, you'll eventually have more forces come back, because the root of these extremist groups is in poverty and unemployment and a lack of opportunities for these very poor people who don't even have electricity, and they are uneducated. I mean, they have no opportunities in their life, so they move toward organized crime and they move toward extremist groups, like in rural parts of Mexico. I mean, these cartels, they often exist because there are no job opportunities. So people just end up, they sell drugs because they have no other opportunities. So anyway, the point is that if the US and France completely defeat these groups militarily, even though it doesn't deal with the root causes, then they no longer have justification for maintaining their military forces in the region. So obviously, after decades, going back to 2001 and the so-called War on Terror, the US-French military strategy did not work in the Sahel. So these countries have also looked to support from Russia, in particular, from Russia's previously the Wagner group, but now really the Russian military, because Wagner was incorporated into the Russian military. They've been looking for security assistance because for decades, these countries have been wrecked by horrible violence from extremist groups. The US and France obviously were not solving it. So these military governments are saying, we're going to take it in our own hands. We're going to work with our neighbors to fight these extremist groups and also get support from Russia, which is why you see all this propaganda in the West claiming that supposedly Russia's controlling them, which is not true at all. The Financial Times published this extremely racist, condescending article recently about Ibrahim Traoré, referring to his supporters in Africa as a cult, and then saying that he's a Russian proxy, which is absurd. The reason that he's so popular is because there are so many, especially young people in Africa, who see him as a model of a pan-African leader. Because Ibrahim Traoré is saying we need to unite as a continent, expel the foreign neocolonial powers, and work together to deal with our own issues, security issues, political issues, and economic issues to develop our countries. And yes, we invite support from Russia and China because they treat us with respect as independent sovereign countries. But he is a symbol of a kind of revolutionary spirit that has existed across Africa for centuries, but especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you had these Pan-African leaders, many of whom were killed and overthrown in Western-backed coups. So I think, I've talked with many people. I'm speaking now from Beijing, and there are a lot of representatives from different African countries here. And I've talked with them, and even from African countries that have good relations with the West, a lot of people see Ibrahim Traoré as a symbolic, heroic figure, and they all want their own Traoré in their own country. Now, the question is, they asked about Nigeria. You have a lot of these kinds of elites in these African countries who are deeply embedded with Western countries. So Nigeria is a country where, I don't expect a kind of revolutionary government to come to power, but Nigeria. So to answer your question, I do not think Nigeria is going to join this Sahelian federation with Burkina Faso. However, even despite the fact that you have these elites who are in some ways embedded into like this, through corrupt clientistic networks, clientele networks with the West, at the same time, they also recognize that there are more and more economic opportunities in the East, which is why Nigeria recently became a partner of BRICS. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, and it has the largest economy in Africa. And they recognize that although they still have good relations with the West, there are more and more opportunities through trade and cooperation with BRICS. And there's a lot of interest in Africa. Ethiopia is now a full member of BRICS. Egypt is now a full member of BRICS. And there are several other countries on the African continent who want to join BRICS. So despite, Saudi Arabia and the UAE also have a lot of pro-Western elites, but their largest trading partner is China. So I think even in Africa, even some of these kind of forces that have historically been more allied with the West, even they are now looking more toward the East and pursuing a more non-aligned foreign policy.
Yeah, Brian, maybe you can take us home here with your final thoughts on, on this question. Burkina Faso literally means, I believe, land of the upright men, right? Land of the upright people. It stems from a really progressive and revolutionary history, as Ben said, from Thomas Sankara, the leader, who was overthrown by a CIA-backed coup, mind you, French and CIA-backed coup. And, the whole idea of someone like Ibrahim Traoré, who there are rumors, I don't know if they've been confirmed, maybe Ben or Brian, if you know, that he, by many of these leaders, were actually trained by the U.S. Africa Command, which is a really hilarious point, because the U.S. Africa Command is supposed to prevent these kind of things from happening. It's supposed to keep Africa away from Russia, away especially from China economically. But it's really supposed to cement the U.S.'s foothold, and it has not done that. It has actually led African countries to pursue even deeper, especially economic cooperation with China, and now even military cooperation with Russia, because the U.S. Africa Command says it's supposed to be fighting terrorism. But the deeper that they get into Africa, especially in the Sahel region, the more terrorism there is. So it's a really interesting dynamic. And Traoré, who is this incredibly charismatic and powerful figure, he is really making the West and the United States lose their minds, because he is not only carrying forward this legacy of his own country, but he's also very outwardly and explicitly stating that both economically and in foreign policy, Burkina Faso and maybe the entirety of the Sahel and maybe the rest of the continent might follow a path that's independent too. Your final thoughts on this question?
I think Ben, in his very well laid out answer, he brought up a very important point. Poverty is what is fueling all of the unrest. And for the collective West, unrest, division, destitution, violence, all of this suits them very well, because it means there's nobody to organize against them and their exploitation of the entire continent. And that's why I brought up Russia, which is bringing actual security, not the illusion of it. And China is bringing in development. This is why the US is so desperate to vilify China, create this idea of debt trap diplomacy, even though most of these nations owe most of their debt to the Western financial institutions. They're doing the same thing all across Latin America. The U.S. military commands in charge of these other parts of the world, far beyond the actual borders of the United States. They maintain media operations to vilify China, especially because of this development drive that they're on. So they're not just coming in and extracting resources through force. They are making a fair exchange. In exchange, they're giving badly needed modern infrastructure. They're building up the necessities, the physical, tangible necessities required for peace, stability, and prosperity. And this is the worst nightmare of any empire. And we remember in Xinjiang, Western China, the US was deliberately radicalizing the ethnic Uyghur population there. And what did China do? Did they go in there and go scorched earth like the US does when they claim they're fighting terrorism? No. They went in there and they developed the region. They lifted all of these people out of poverty. They invested heavily in education and infrastructure. And they dealt with the extremists by reforming them, reintroducing them into society, giving them a constructive role to play. This is how China is approaching this. And the US doesn't want people to know this, because if you knew the details of any of this, it would be so obvious that China, the multipolar world in general, this mentality is the future ordinary people would obviously choose over the continued, as Secretary, to circle back to the beginning, Secretary Hegseth and the status quo, where the US determines everything for everybody, everywhere, for its own interests, and at the absolute expense of everyone else on the planet. Look at Ukraine. They're fighting this proxy war on behalf of the US, completely at their own expense. The island province of Taiwan will be the surface scoured from existence to serve US interests at the cost of their very existence. The Philippines, already mired in deep poverty, again, to serve US interests at their own expense. So this is the battle that is taking place. The battle lines are being drawn everywhere, including across the continent of Africa. I don't focus on Africa. I focus mostly on Asia. But I remember, Danny, you were talking about terrorism, U.S. terrorism. Where are they getting all these weapons? They're not digging them out of the sand, not picking them off palm trees. They came in through these huge CIA operations. Libya, remember 2011, flow of weapons and equipment into Libya to overthrow the government there, and they deliberately used the destroyed Libya that they themselves created as a springboard for destabilization across the rest of North Africa, West Africa, and then into the Middle East and beyond. They're doing that in Syria right now. So it's the same playbook. People just got to see that. It's the same playbook. They're doing it everywhere, and that is the reason why.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, Danny. Let's not forget that the renowned investigative journalist Seymour Hersh famously reported in this article the red line and the rat line. He talked about how after the U.S.-led NATO forces overthrew the Libyan government and killed the revolutionary anti-colonial leader Muammar Gaddafi and destroyed the Libyan state, unleashing chaos still to today. There's still an ongoing civil war in Libya, and unleashing slavery. There are now open air slave markets in Libya. But anyway, after NATO destroyed Libya, which had been the most prosperous country on the African continent with the highest standard of living, then what happened? Those weapons from the Libyan military were used by the US to send to Syria. And as Brian mentioned, they went all around the region in North Africa to these extremist groups. But we know Seymour Hersh reported that they were specifically going to Syria, which went to Al Qaeda and ISIS and all these extremist groups. So, I mean, all of these weapons, they all go directly back to these U.S. imperialist operations, regime change operations, and wars. And you look at North Africa and West Africa, these countries have been completely destabilized through decades of Western military intervention. And then the West says, oh, Russia can't send a few hundred troops to go help these countries at the request of their governments. The Libyan government did not request NATO to bomb them into submission and destroy their state. Whereas These are sovereign countries in Africa that are asking for military assistance from Russia. They have the right to do so. It's the exact opposite. The US destabilized these countries, and now they're asking for help from Russia and China to help stabilize their countries. It's the exact opposite.
Yeah, well, I think this is a great place. We've covered a lot of ground today to end the stream. It's quite early for you guys and late over here. So without further ado, be sure to hit the like button before you all go. That's how you keep this stream going in the algorithm even after we are through. I have both Ben and Brian's YouTube channels in the video description, the New Atlas with Brian Berletic and Geopolitical Economy Report with Ben Norton. So be sure to subscribe and support their work. All the places to support this work are in the video description as well for this channel, Patreon, Substack, and so many more. I will be back in about 15 hours, actually, for an update on what's happening in Gaza and West Asia. Ali Abunima, Low-Key, and Mohammed Marandi will be joining, so be sure to wait in there. On the link can be found. Actually, you can just go to the channel after you're through here, and you can find that for 2 p.m. Eastern and hit the notifications bell for that. Without further ado, everybody, Brian, Ben, any final thoughts before we head out of here?
No, just thank you for having me on. And Ben, as always, great to share the screen with you.
Yeah, same, Brian. It's always a pleasure. Keep up the great work you do. I always appreciate it at the New Atlas. It's very thorough research. And Danny, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. And thanks for facilitating these discussions. It was fun.
Of course. Yeah, no, we'll do it again at some point in the near future. And everybody, good night, good morning, wherever you are. We'll be back again soon. Bye-bye.